Hey, good afternoon. Welcome from Baltimore, in the old Fells Point neighbourhood at the moment, as you can see down by the water. Was going to shoot a live stream video today. I had some connectivity problems, so instead we're adopting the standard backup plan that we have, which is to record static video offline, and then we'll upload that later to Facebook and to YouTube. So apologies for the connectivity issues earlier on, and wasn't able to meet the 12 o'clock live stream as advertised, but we're in the backup plan and we're going to get this tour done, kicking off right now. Hi, so as I said, I'm in the historic Fells Point neighbourhood of Baltimore, slightly east of the immediate downtown Inner Harbour area. As you can see, this is a waterfront district, a historic district dating back to the early 18th century. Always was a waterfront district, still is a waterfront district. As you can see way behind me there over at Canton is the Navy Reserve Terminal. Let's have a quick tour around. The Domino Sugar Factory behind me. Pier behind me here is where they actually filmed Homicide, Life on the Street TV show 20 years ago. This was a tugboat terminal, now a swanky hotel. So this always was a waterfront neighbourhood. Today, 2022, it's a very bohemian neighbourhood. A lot of bars, cafes, hotels, antique shops, some eclectic mix where the old shabbiness meets with the new shine. So very sort of like mixed bohemian touristy neighbourhood. In the early 19th century, though, the period in which we're talking about, the 1810s, so really the period 1812, 1815, this was a thriving working waterfront neighbourhood. Had tobacco warehouses, had slipways and piers. The slipways in particular, Baltimore was famous for its shipbuilding in this period, specialised in topsail schooners, small, highly manoeuvrable, fast craft that were used and intended to be used for coastal trade, but because they were quick and adept at handling, they were good as blockade runners and could also be fitted out with light cannon and used as privateers. And that becomes part of the story that we'll be telling later on today. So between 1810 and 1815, the slipways here at Fells Point, they built about 150 of these ships. Very few of that design survive today. There's a modern reproduction called the Pride of Baltimore, which is designed after one of these privateers known as the Chasseur. We'll talk about the Chasseur and its captain later on in the story as well. But so Baltimore had been producing these ships primarily for trade, for shipping cargo, but then they became blockade runners and privateers. So, you know, privateer is a privately owned ship which has been issued with a letter of marque and authorization from the government to act as like an independent warship almost. So not crewed by regular sailors, regular military personnel, crewed by civilians operating under this license that say if they can capture a British merchant ship, they get to split it up and sell the proceeds. So, you know, whatever the cargo is that you capture, the United States government gets a cut of that money, but also the crew of the ship gets some prize money. It was kind of like a private enterprise business. And so Baltimore had become famous for that in this period, and consequently had been known as and referred to in the Times of London as a nest of pirates, smugglers, blockade runners. Remember, this is a period in which Britain is at war with Napoleonic France, and so Britain's seeking to control global trade, blockade France, and prevent goods from entering France and goods from leaving France. So it's been blockading those ports, and American ships are trying to slip in and out and trade with France and trade with Europe. So much to the chagrin of the British government and the Royal Navy in particular. A quick by-the-by guide to some of the things you can see in downtown Fells Point today. Sláinte behind me. It's an Irish bar, one of those fake Irish bars really, but it's notable for big screen TV, and it shows English Premier League football games. So if you're a Liverpool fan like myself, this is a good place to be on a Saturday if you want to get a pie and a pint and watch the game. Next to that is Cooper's Tavern. Cooper's also has a food truck, Cooper's Chowhound. Cooper's, nice bar, but really famous for its burgers. If you really like a good burger, Cooper's is a good place to go and get one of those. So I really want to talk today about Baltimore in the War of 1812, which of course raises the question, what was the War of 1812? Well, the War of 1812 is often subsumed by the greater conflict in that period, which was the Revolutionary Wars with France and then the Napoleonic Wars with France. So that big spanning period is the predominant historical event that's occurring in the late 18th, early 19th century. And so therefore, when you look at the War of 1812, which is 1812 to 1815, so just, slightly less than 3 years, it's often seen as a sideshow and often overlooked. But for the people involved in it, of course, it was not a sideshow, particularly for the people of the United States. This was their involvement in that global conflict. So you can see the War of 1812 as either part of the overall Napoleonic and French and global wars that took place as a result of that, or you can see it as a standalone conflict. So let's take it as a standalone conflict. I think it's easier to discuss it in those terms without bringing too much of the external French and Spanish and British and international politics into it. So if we just look at it from a purely American point of view, if you will. So the War of 1812 is a conflict between the United States and Great Britain. The United States is a young nation. Remember, we're talking about 1812, so it hasn't been a nation for very long at all. And in this period, the United States is still predominantly clustered on the east coast where those original 13 colonies were, although it's starting to expand westward into the interior. Now, this raises some conflict with the population that's already in that interior, particularly in what we call the Old Northwest. So the Northwest, we're not talking about Seattle and Washington and Portland and Oregon. We're not talking about that Northwest. We're talking about the Old Northwest, which would be the states that we now know as Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So that was the Old Northwest. That was an area in which the United States, the young United States, sought to expand territorially. So its settlement would expand westward into this area. Now, of course, there were already people living there, native tribes, indigenous peoples living in those areas. And they naturally wanted to resist the expansion of American settlement into that area. They couldn't do it on their own, and so they looked for allies. And the natural ally that they found was the British. Now, the British, of course, had been defeated in the War of Independence, but had retained the Canadian colonies to the north, and had maintained friendly relations with indigenous tribes in the Old Northwest. So when United States forces started pushing into the Old Northwest to open that up for settlement, and came into conflict with the Native American tribes in those areas, those tribes sought assistance from the British. So the British were essentially helping block American expansion to the west. So the American desire for expansion being blocked by the British was one of the reasons, one of the causes that would lead to the outbreak of war. The other cause, the main other cause, and the one that is often cited as the main cause, the principal cause, sometimes to the exclusion of any others, is free trade and sailors' rights. So what do we mean by that? Well, we talked about how the British government had blockaded Napoleonic France, had blockaded its ports, seeking to stop international trade with France. Now that would annoy American businessmen, American shipping agents, American ship owners that wanted to trade with France. They wanted free trade. They did not want to be restricted by the whims of the British government and ordered around by the Royal Navy and prevented from trading with France. So there was this requirement that American shipping wanted to be free and wanted to be able to trade with whoever they wanted to trade with. So free trade. And now sailors' rights. Sailors' rights was a contentious issue. In this period, the Royal Navy is absolutely huge. These are sailing ships manned by hundreds of men, and we're talking about hundreds of ships. So the demand for trained sailors to maneuver these ships and fight these ships, the demand for trained men who knew how to sail and knew how to work a large ship, that demand for that manpower was immense and could not be met through natural means. You can recruit somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. You could go to rural Norfolk once the harvest was over and that corn had been gathered in, and recruit some farm boys from good old Norfolk who didn't know one end of a ship from the other, and they would be classified as a landsman. It wouldn't even be an ordinary seaman. You'd be a landsman. You'd be taken on board and you'd have to be trained up from scratch to understand how to be a sailor. So far easier, surely, to find people that were experienced sailors and recruit those into the Navy. Well, not everybody wanted to join the Royal Navy. It was probably more profitable to be in the Merchant Marine. You could take a share of profit that way. It was more, certainly less strenuous discipline in the Merchant Marine. The Royal Navy would flog you and would flog you to death for misdemeanors and crimes. And would hang you from a yardarm for all sorts of contraventions of articles of war. So life in the Royal Navy was harsh and people sought to avoid that. So to fill these ships, it became necessary to press men into service. The old press gang, you'd come down to, well, you wouldn't do it here in Fells Point, but you'd come down to a neighbourhood in a waterfront area in Britain, a town like Portsmouth, a town like Plymouth, town like Harwich maybe, and you'd come after thrown out time and the bars were closing and the men were being tossed out in a state of inebriation, and you'd jump a few of them and they'd wake up the next morning and they'd find themselves on one of His Majesty's ships, His Majesty's men of war, sworn in, subject to Admiral instructions and King's regulations, and on those articles of war, you couldn't leave now. Now you're in the Royal Navy, and if you left, that was desertion for which you could be hung. So essentially you were being kidnapped and pressed into service. If you couldn't find the men on shore, you'd find the men at sea. You'd see a merchant ship on the horizon. You'd throw on as much canvas as you could to catch up with it. You'd maybe put a shot across its bow, make it heel to, and send a boarding party aboard, and then you'd say, well, I'm going to take 10 seamen off your ship, and hey presto, they're all in the Royal Navy now. And this became a bone of contention with American sailors, that then what they regarded as neutral American ships were being stopped at sea by the Royal Navy, and American sailors, American merchant marine mariners, were being hauled off of ships and conscripted against their will into the Royal Navy. Now, there were no real passports in these days. It was difficult to prove a man's nationality. You could have been born in Britain, you could have been born in England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. You could have, so you would have been born a British citizen. You could have, though, moved to the Americas and lived in the Americas for 20 years, and the British government would still regard you as a British citizen and subject to conscription into the Royal Navy, whereas the American government would consider you to be a neutral American, and it's a terrible thing if you're conscripted and kidnapped by the Royal Navy. So the whole issue of sailors' rights and the freedom of a sailor to declare themselves to be an American and not subject to impressment was a major issue as well. So really those are the two issues. The freedom of American merchant marine to operate at sea without interference by the Royal Navy, so that whole free trade and sailors' rights, and then also the desire by the American government and American merchants and American politicians to expand territorially into the northwest and open up new states and new land, new territory for settlement. So those are the two causes, and those became causes of the outbreak of war in 1812. The president at the time is James Madison. It's sometimes known as Mr. Madison's War, and takes place 1812 to 1815, during which time James Madison is president. And so that is the War of 1812, causes thereof and the duration thereof. So now let's talk about the role of Baltimore in the War of 1812. Here's a question for you as I sit here in Baltimore, 3,500 miles away from my hometown. What made me travel 3,500 miles from Essex, so east of London, to live here in Maryland, a little northwest of Washington DC? What made me travel those 3,500 miles? I mean, the answer is quite simple. The answer is I love my wife, and this is where she lived, so this is where I moved to. So for me, easy enough to answer. Another question. The War of 1812, and we're going to be looking at the Battle of North Point and then the subsequent probe on to Hampstead Hill. In that ground phase of the Battle of Baltimore, one of the regiments that fought there, one of the British regiments that fought there, was the 44th Foot, the East Essex Regiment of Foot. Local boys to my hometown. If I'd have been alive and kicking in 1810, 1811, and thought that joining the army to go and fight the monster Napoleon would have been a great idea, if I'd have wanted to take the King's Shilling, I would have probably ended up in the 44th, which would have taken me to Portugal and Spain, and then on a ship all the way here to the United States to fight in the War of 1812, and to come and fight in September of 1814 down at North Point on what would now be the section of I-695 Baltimore Beltway going down towards the Francis Scott Key Bridge, in the vicinity of where the old Beth Steel plant used to be, down there to the east of Baltimore City itself. So what brought those Essex boys 3,500 miles across the Atlantic to fight a battle here? Well, they were in the army. They'd taken the King's Shilling. If they didn't come, they'd be flogged, and then they'd come anyway. So deciding that you were not going to go was not an option if you were an ordinary soldier. You were going to go wherever King George sent you, and it happened that he was sending men to fight and to die here in the Americas. So that's why those men from the 44th were here. What motivated them to fight? The usual motivation: the man to the left of you and the man to the right of you. So your comrades in arms, the men that you slept out under the stars with, the men that you slept in squalid barracks with, the men that you drank with, the men that you fought brawls with in the street, the men that you womanized with, your battle buddies, your friends, your confidants. That's one of the reasons that men fought, and one of the reasons that people continue to fight for the person either side of you. But what else? Well, the war in the peninsula, the war in Portugal and Spain, have been noted particularly from the British perspective for looting, for the sack of towns. A city that had not capitulated and had then been captured was subject to be looted, sacked, sometimes in a more organised fashion and sometimes in a violent and disorganised and mob-like, frightening fashion. So the prospect of loot was there. The battle that had been fought at Bladensburg had led to the occupation of Washington DC. Prior to the Battle of Baltimore, Washington DC had been occupied by British troops, including the 44th, and they'd gone in and they'd burned government buildings and they'd looted government buildings. So they looted the Library of Congress, they looted the White House, they looted the United States Capitol. So there were some interesting trinkets to be had if you could get into a town that had not capitulated to you and loot that town. So that was another motivation for those British troops, the belief that if they conquered the American militia, these American militia would run at the first sight of trained British troops. These were hardened veterans from the war in the Peninsula, the war in Portugal and Spain. These were hardened troops who'd fought against Napoleon. So they were hard men and they knew how to fight. They didn't think that the American militia would be any impediment to them, that they would blow through the American militia would rout and run away, they would march victoriously into Baltimore and sack and loot Baltimore as they'd sacked and looted Washington DC. So the prospect of loot was there. So two principal motivations, perhaps three. First, that you fought alongside your comrades. You did not want to let them down. So when they went to battle, you went to battle with them. That's the primary motivation. Second motivation is loot. So above and beyond your meager pay, the prospect that you'd be able to get drunk by breaking into a wine cellar or a tavern and stuff your pockets with trinkets, so some loot. There's perhaps a motivation that if you didn't do as you were told, you'd be flogged, so the fear of being flogged. And whether people were motivated by zeal and love for king and country, perhaps the officer class, but whether that was a motivation for the enlisted man, for the common soldier, the British Tommy, I'm not sure whether that really was, whether patriotism and love of king and country was really a motivating factor, and why men joined the army and why men fought, rather than it was somewhere to go, it was somewhere that would intermittently feed you well and intermittently pay you and give you the opportunity to gather some loot if you survived the battles. So patriotic motivation, I don't think was really there for the common soldier, for the common British soldier. Now whether it was there for the common American soldier is another matter altogether, because remember, these were not professional soldiers from the American army, these were militiamen, these were local men that had occupations and lived in the community. These were farmers and merchants and tavern owners and shipbuilders and shipworkers and brickwrights and carpenters and shoemakers. These were local men from Maryland who were defending their homes and defending their state and defending their country, so it was very immediate to them. And the sense of patriotism is one of the things that comes out of the War of 1812. America is forged in the Revolutionary War and the War of Independence, and there's the Constitutional Convention, which produces the Constitution of the United States, which is then ratified, and you form this country essentially by a Revolutionary War followed by a lot of lawyering. And so whether patriotism comes from that, or whether people still consider themselves to be a man from New Jersey or a man from Maryland or a man from Florida at that point, or a man from the United States, is moot. But certainly the War of 1812, when that's concluded, particularly with a focus on the Star-Spangled Banner, that American flag as a symbol of a united states, I think that the patriotism that comes from the American point of view is stronger as a result of the War of 1812. The motivation is more patriotic amongst the common soldiery, because they are fighting on their home ground and they're fighting for defence of their hearth and their home and defence of their country. And so the patriotism, I think, on the American point of view, is stronger than the patriotic impulse from the British point of view. Just a personal reflection on that, on what would make a man come 3,500 miles to fight here in the United States versus what would make a man come 25 miles down the road from Harford County with his militia unit to fight here at North Point or up on Hampstead Heath. As you can see, I've changed location from Fells Point. I'm now across the other side of the harbour at Fort McHenry, and we're going to continue the story from here as we talk about the two phases of the ground campaign in the Battle of Baltimore and also the seaborne phase of that, the bombardment of Fort McHenry itself. So welcome to Fort McHenry. It is national monument and national shrine. Important to note that it is a national shrine. You can see the flag, a small flag today, but the flag is flying there proudly. The Star-Spangled Banner does indeed fly over those ramparts, even to this day. I mean, it will come down when they sound colours later on this afternoon, and it will go back up in the morning. But right now, here at Fort McHenry, there's the flag. So the primary episode in the history of Baltimore during the War of 1812 is the Battle of Baltimore. Now, the Battle of Baltimore is not one particular event. It's essentially three events in one, and so three phases of the same battle. It's a good trick question if you're a Maryland middle school or high school teacher to ask, well, in the War of 1812, when did the Battle of Baltimore take place? A lot of people are going to say, obviously, well, 1812, but the battle took place in September of 1814. So that's your trick, mean quiz question if you're a history teacher. So I'm actually out here at Fort McHenry now. I've moved across the bay, well, no, the harbour, sorry, from where I was over at Fells Point, talking about the shipping over there at Fells Point, and I've moved over here to the other side of the harbour so that we can talk about the ground phase of the campaign. Took place initially on the other side of the Patapsco River here, so if I just do a quick spin, you can see a stretch of the harbour behind me there where the river comes in from the Chesapeake Bay, and we're looking over there towards a neighbourhood called Canton. If you go across Canton, you'll move towards neighbourhoods further down the river, such as Essex and Dundalk, until eventually you get to a neck of land right at the edge of the river and the edge of the Chesapeake Bay called North Point. And the first phase of the Battle of Baltimore, that's where that took place. So on the far bank of that river, but way down the river. In fact, if I walk up to where the artillery emplacement is here, the Fort McHenry Guard, a Park Service preservation reenactment troop, perform drill here in period uniform, 1812 uniform, and they also have some working gun emplacements here where they do artillery demonstrations. So as you can see up on the fort itself, there are some very large Columbiad cannons mounted. Those, of course, are filled and incapable of firing, and really there for just demonstrative purposes alone. But the Fort McHenry Guard themselves have this row here, an emplacement, a wooden emplacement, banked on the other side with a battery of 4 working cannon, in which they use for demonstrations. If you come up here in September towards the anniversary of the battle, you'll see them work these guns. It's a roped off area, but I'm going to walk around the side of it, not going to intrude into it, but able to get a good view. We were at Fells Point on the essentially the inner part of the harbour, and now we're looking at the outer part of the harbour down there. In the distance you can see the Francis Scott Key Bridge. 695, the Baltimore Beltway crosses that. But you can see down on this bank, almost at where the edge of the bridge was, is a neighbourhood called Dundalk. It used to be home of Bethlehem Steel. That factory's long since gone. We can see over there the other side of the river. So the Coast Guard shipyard is across there. Baltimore Harbour is a big harbour, big container port, and also a big bulk cargo port to this day. So I'm here at Fort McHenry, but I'm going to be talking about some activity that took down there at North Point. So why Baltimore? Why was the British government interested in Baltimore? Why was it a strategic location that interested the British Army and the British Navy? First of all, there's this harbour. It's a beautiful harbour. So just alone seizing the harbour would give you a significant advantage for control of the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic seaboard. Also, you have fortifications such as Fort McHenry that are protecting the harbour. If those fortifications can be overcome, then they can be turned and used as defensive positions for British forces instead of American forces. Third, we have this notion of Baltimore as being a nest of pirates, those blockade runners, those privateers, those small schooner ships that the Royal Navy in particular wanted to put an end to. And also, with the defeat of the American army at Bladensburg and the looting and destruction and burning of Washington DC, the British Army was on a roll. It had success in the field. It was confident. The troops that had been brought here were veteran troops, and Baltimore was the next logical city for them to move against. So actually just moved around now in front of the artillery position so you can get a better view of the earthwork. So behind it you have that revetment of wood, and now I'm on the facing side, on this closest side. As you can see, it's sloped to deflect incoming rounds. Also a very thick bank, a good 20 to 30 feet of packed soil. And then, if you can see under that yellow tarp there, at the end of that firing port, there's a rather large cannon, and there are 4 of those in the battery here. So the British had designs on Baltimore. They wanted to capture Baltimore. They knew that they would have to approach from 2 directions. They would have to approach from seaward, from the Chesapeake Bay into the harbour, try and subdue the harbour defences, and then sail gunboats into the harbour so that they could bombard the city itself. So that was the naval side of the equation. On the army side of the equation would be to prevent forces from fleeing Baltimore and regrouping somewhere else, and also to possibly pin those forces here and destroy them on the ground, as they've been destroyed at Bladensburg. The British Army sought to destroy a second American army here at Baltimore. So as the Navy steamed its fighting ships and its bombard ships into the harbour to commence and begin preparation for the seaward phase, for the naval phase of the Battle of Baltimore, the Army, the ground force component under Major General Robert Ross, landed down at North Point to begin its advance on the city. Now, Ross had a little under 5,000 men under his command in total, so 3,700 experienced British troops, veterans of fighting against the French in Europe, so in Portugal and Spain, so hardened men, veteran troops, so a solid core of those. He had then about 1,000 Marines, Royal Marines, that had been taken from the naval ships and also some locally recruited colonial Marines. A battalion of those that had been attached, about 1,000 Marines and about 3,700 soldiers. So effectively a force of slightly under 5,000. A good-sized force for its day. It might not sound much when compared to a World War I battle or a World War II battle, where you talk about tens or hundreds of thousands of men participating in a battle, but an army of 5,000 was a significant, trained, organised military force in 1812, in 1814. So Ross was an experienced general, and he led that force up from the neck at North Point towards Baltimore, skirting around. Really, if you're down there on the Francis Scott Key Bridge at the bottom of the bay there, and you're coming around 695, and you follow 695 round towards Essex and towards 95 where it joins, you're essentially following the route there. Not exactly, but when you stand on the North Point battlefield in particular, if you're standing on the North Point battlefield in the British position and you look to your right, you can see 695. So you're very close to where the line of march and the line of advance took place. So the American forces opposing them were under the command of Major General Samuel Smith, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, but a militia general. The troops that he commanded were not regulars. The American army was very, very small. The regular American army was very, very small. America in that period did not believe in having a large standing army. It had a small standing army, and then it had militias. The individual states would call out their trained militia. So they had uniforms, they had muskets, they had cannon. They were organised in military formations, but these were not regular troops. These were not men that were 24 hours a day soldiers. These were men that were members of the community. They were farmers from Harford and Cecil County. They were tobacco merchants from the Eastern Shore. They were ship caulkers and rope makers and sail makers from Fells Point. They were bankers and bookkeepers and tradesmen from the city of Baltimore itself. So a mix of reservists, a mix of militia, and they were called out to defend their city. Now, in a stand-up fight, even if you had odds of 2-1 or 3-1 numerically in favour of the militia, you would expect the trained British force to win out through disciplined musketry and use of the bayonet, and their discipline and their training would pay off, and they'd be easily able to push aside the American militia. So as I say, these may be men that had a musket or a rifle at home and maybe hunted for the cooking pot. But there's a lot of difference between stalking a white-tailed deer up in Cecil County and popping a white-tailed deer to be butchered for the larder than it is standing in line of battle, receiving volleys and receiving artillery fire and not panicking under fire and maintaining a steady rate of fire. There's a lot of difference between the casual civilian use of a hunting firearm and the military use and deployment of and military training that's required to stand a line of battle. So these men did muster periodically throughout the year. Those musters would be a head count, check that you had your uniform, you had your musket, and then possibly a little bit of drill, a little bit of marching around, but it would usually coincide with the carnival, and then you'd be straight into the hard cider and the Maryland whiskey. So these were men that were defending their own soil. We talked about that earlier, what motivated men to fight. So what motivated the British soldiers to fight was discipline, comradeship, and the expectation of booty, the expectation of loot. Those were some of the things that motivated the British troops to fight. Also fear of the lash, so fear of being punished. And maybe for the officer class, a love of king and country. Maybe not so much of a motivation for the ordinary soldier. Tommy Atkins with his flintlock Brown Bess musket may not have cared much about king and country, other than the fact that you got to stick it to His Majesty's enemies and give them a good drubbing, and then empty their pockets of gold and silver, and perhaps loot their wine cellar or loot a tavern. So the motivations, I think, for the British common soldier were much more material than patriotic. For the American militia, though, we're talking about men that are defending their own territory, men that are defending their own land. When those troops landed down there at North Point on the neck there and marched up through what's now Essex and Dundalk and through Baltimore County on the outskirts of the city, they're marching through farmland and marching through small towns and settlements where some of these militiamen came from. So the enemy was marching through your towns, and the enemy would lay waste to your towns and steal your horse and steal your pig and take a chicken and raid your corn crib. And if you had a barrel of hard cider, they would drink that dry. And if you had a bottle of whiskey, they were certainly going to take that. And certainly they would move through that land like a swarm of locusts. So having the enemy on your own soil tends to focus the mind a little bit more about what you're fighting for. And so in that degree, the American troops were fighting a more patriotic battle, perhaps, than the British troops. They had much more motivation to fight and defend their country, even though they lacked the training. So the American tactic, devised by Samuel Smith, Major General Samuel Smith, was twofold. One, he would send a large brigade of militia down to meet the British. The forces were roughly the same size, about 5,000 versus 5,000, so he'd send a brigade of troops down towards North Point to fight a delaying action. He did not expect them to beat the British. He just hoped they would not be routed. He hoped that they would delay the British for an hour, 2 hours, perhaps half a day, to give the rest of his force time to prepare defensive positions around the city. The defensive positions included Fort McHenry, but also included on the eastern approaches to the town a mass mobilisation of the civilian population, so women, children, city residents, slaves were all mobilised to the defence of the city into digging a series of trenches and earthworks on the eastern approaches to the city that could be turned into gun batteries with supporting infantry trenches, that the militia would have strong defensive positions on the east of the city, so as the British troops advanced they would come into fortified defended positions. But Smith needed time to complete the digging and the construction of those trenches. Trenches do not dig themselves. There was no mechanical means of doing that. In those days it was a man or a woman with a shovel and perhaps a bucket, literally digging by hand. So that had to be dug by hand, and approximately a mile of defences were dug there to the east of the city, and particularly focused on a place called Hampstead Hill, some high ground to the east of the city, just above Fells Point where we were. It's the high ground above that. Was known at the time as Hampstead Hill. It's now known as Patterson Park, named after Betsy Patterson, the Patterson family, that were, if you know the story of Betsy Patterson marrying I believe Jerome Bonaparte. So she was Betsy Patterson Bonaparte, and then the Bonaparte family having to try and get that marriage annulled because they did not want one of the members of the Bonaparte family, one of Napoleon's brothers, married to an American girl. So there's a little story in that might be worth looking into if you're interested in that, and the Betsy Patterson Bonaparte story. Anyway, so that's now known as Patterson Park. If you're driving through Baltimore and you're looking for the location of that, Patterson Park, it's got a big pagoda on it. It's got a memorial to General Pulaski from the Revolutionary War is there. There's a Ukrainian church across the way. That's where the Polish festival and the Ukrainian festival and the Greek festival are held every year in Patterson Park. But at the time it was known as Hampstead Hill, and it was above the town, it was above the city, it was some high ground that could be defended. And so Smith sent a brigade of troops down to North Point to fight a delaying action while he kept the rest of his troops and the population of the city engaged in building these defensive earthworks. So the Battle of North Point itself is a very straightforward battle for the British. They split into two wings, one wing to pin the American forces at the front, and then the second wing to move around on the British right, so the American left, and try and turn the American flank, which did, in the end, rout the American troops and send them reeling back, but not before disaster had befallen the British Army. Major General Ross, the field officer in command, the commander of the British ground forces, mounted on a horse, as field officers were in those days, not on foot. He's a general, he's up on a horse, was struck and mortally wounded by a musket ball or perhaps a rifle bullet. So there's two schools of thought about that. One is that a heroic American sniper hiding up a tree with a rifled musket, perhaps a fowling piece or a hunting piece used for hunting deer, a backwoodsman, a man that knew how to shoot and how to fire over long distance, spied this officer on a horse and levelled his rifle and picked him off at a great distance, quite deliberately. Or it could have just been that he was a man on a horse, sitting a good 6 foot higher than everybody else, and when a panicked volley of musket fire came in from the American ranks that was perhaps fired high, as panicking or inexperienced troops do tend to fire high, he was perhaps just simply caught by a musket ball by accident. But whatever happened to him, Major General Ross fell mortally wounded, and for a time there the British advance halted. The American forces then had time to withdraw from the battlefield, regroup, and make their way back towards the city. So they were not completely overrun. It was not a disaster, as Smith had perhaps feared it could be. It could have easily been a sacrifice of that American unit, that American brigade at North Point. They could have been completely overwhelmed by the British and put to the bayonet. But a significant number of them were able to withdraw. And having delayed the British there and having mortally wounded, killed the British commanding officer, the British general in charge of those forces, that put the British forces into some disarray. So the senior colonel took over, Colonel Arthur Brooke, commanding the 44th Regiment, East Essex Regiment. Would have been my local regiment. I'm an Essex boy myself. I'm an East Essex boy myself. So these were, if you discount the number of Londoners and Irishmen and Scotsmen that were in most British regiments, regardless of what counties they were enrolled in, the local boys, local farm boys, would have been Essex boys from my neck of the woods out there in Braintree and Malden and Burnham and Colchester and Clacton and those places. So Colonel Arthur Brooke assumed command of the British Field Army. It took Brooke some time to establish his command, and also to reorganise the troops and get them moving towards Baltimore. So they'd won a victory at North Point. The Battle of North Point, I think, counts as a British victory, that phase. But they had not. It was a tactical victory rather than a strategic victory. They'd held the field at the end of the battle, but they'd lost their general, and also the American forces that were on the battle had been able to withdraw into defensive positions around Baltimore. So as Ross moved forward, the British Army had now not been delayed for an hour or 2 hours. The British Army had been delayed for the best part of a day. When Ross approached the outskirts of Baltimore, nightfall was approaching. He decided against a night attack against positions he had not reconnoitred and did not know about. He decided to wait until morning. The American troops and the American civilians from Baltimore worked through the night to continue improving their entrenchments. And when Ross awoke on the morning of the 13th of September, having wasted almost an entire day now with that delaying action and marching up the neck, found that there was at least a mile of entrenchments facing him. So of course, rather than send his troops into a frontal assault, he sent parties up and down the line looking for gaps in the line, looking for a flank to turn, so probing and reconnaissance action, but was unable to find any gap in the American line over a mile of defences. If he'd have moved much further to the north, his line of communication back to the transport ships would have been exposed, and the Americans could have then cut him off in a pincer movement. So, having, he believed, no option, he could not launch a frontal attack and he could not march further to the north and cut his line of communication, Brooke decided to return to the transports and march the troops all the way back down through to North Point and through to the transports, which effectively ended the ground phase, the two parts of the ground phase of the Battle of Baltimore, which then brings us to Fort McHenry, this impressive star fort behind us, mounted with multiple cannon, commanded by Major Armistead, flying, today it's flying a small weather flag because the weather is a bit brutal, but if you come up here on a still summer day when they have the large flag out, that will be the largest American flag you have ever seen in your life. And that's exactly what Armistead wanted. He wanted a flag so big that if you were anchored down there where the Key Bridge is now, if you were anchored down there by the Lazaretto, that you'd be able to see this flag from miles away. So he sent into the town, and he had the largest flag that could possibly be made, and bought a ship's mast here to use as a flagpole, and they still use a ship's mast as a flagpole today, and flew this gigantic star-spangled banner over the fort as an act of patriotic inspiration and an act of defiance to the British. So the British now launched a seaborne attack, coming into the waters behind me here with regular ships of the line, so frigates, two-deckers, three-deckers, bringing those ships in that had cannon, but you have to come pretty close with cannon, so that bulk carrier across the way there at the grain elevator, you mount a cannon in here, they could probably hit me, but if you're further down across towards the Coast Guard yard across there, you're out of cannon range. So the British, as well as their men of war, which they did not want to get in so close that they would engage in a duel with the cannons on the fort, it's a maxim repeated by Nelson himself that only a fool would fight a fort. So you don't want to lay your ships off a fort and get in an engagement with the fort, because the fort will usually batter the heck out of your wooden walls on your ships before you can inflict much damage on the fort itself. So the British strategy was different. They brought in bombard ships, they brought in barges, they brought in small ships they converted to fire rockets, explosive rockets, and it also mounted heavy mortars on them that would fire large explosive shells. It would lob those mortar shells high trajectory over the defences, over these walls of the fort, hoping to explode inside the fort, cause casualties inside the fort, dismount guns, perhaps hit the powder magazine. So they fired explosive shells from these bombard ships, these fleet of ships that they brought in, and rockets, just giant gunpowder rockets. So like a firework that you'd fire today, you light the fuse and you stand back and whoosh, off it goes. The only difference today is that that firework goes up in the sky and bursts in bright colours, whereas what they were helping was that the rocket would fly over the walls and explode in a shower of shrapnel and explosives above the fort itself. So this sustained bombardment began on the afternoon of the 13th of September. So Admiral Coburn, who's out here commanding the force, does not know at that point that Colonel Brooke is already withdrawing the troops. He believes that he's now putting pressure on Fort McHenry and putting pressure on the seaward defences, and then that the British Army will march in from the rear and take the city from the rear. So he commences his attack on the afternoon of the 13th. The weather's not great. There's a lot of rain, there's a lot of thunder, which adds to the noise and the confusion, but the bombardment lasts all night. It continues throughout the night. Solid bombardment of the fort. The fort tries to return fire, and there are some casualties in the fort because the men have to expose themselves to load and fire their cannon. But predominantly the amount of fire coming in from the British side is much heavier, much more sustained than the Americans can respond with. At one point, one of the giant 60-pound explosive shells actually hits the powder magazine, the roof of the powder magazine, and fortunately for the Americans, did not detonate. If it had, it would have taken up the powder magazine, it would have probably taken out the entire fort, and that would have been the end of the affair for the American defenders here in Baltimore, and Baltimore would probably have fallen. But as it was, the shell that hit the powder magazine, thankfully for the Americans, did not detonate. As a consequence, the fort is still here to this day. The bombardment continued through the night and into the morning, and as the mist and the fog cleared and the bombardment ceased and the British looked upon the fort to see what was going on. Was the fort still there? Had they run up a surrender flag? No, they had not run up a surrender flag. Major Armistead ordered the morning signal gun fired and raised that giant flag above the fort. Out there in the harbour, as well as the British ships, were a few ships that were known as truce ships. So these were neutral ships. They were ships that would carry American plenipotentiary negotiators that had been given neutral status. These were the men that would negotiate for the treatment of casualties and the exchange and return of prisoners. So these were truce ships. Out there on one of the truce ships is a young attorney, Francis Scott Key, and standing on the deck of that ship in the morning and hearing the signal gun fire from Fort McHenry and looking out at the fort and seeing that flag, that giant flag, Stars and Stripes, flying here, so inspired him after the night of shot and shell and storming gunfire. And he'd been certain throughout the night that the fort would be destroyed and that the Baltimore city would fall. And to wake up in the morning as an American and realise that the fort was still there and the flag was still there gave him great hope and great inspiration. He decided to put his thoughts not in a letter to the editor, not in a diary entry, but he decided to commit his thoughts to poetry, and that poetry was then set to the tune of an old drinking song. And whatever happened to that tune? Oh yeah, that would be the national anthem. That'd be the Star-Spangled Banner. So yeah, when we think about, does that Star-Spangled Banner yet wave? Well, yes it does. There it is. It's a weather flag today, just a small one. When we come back here in June, July, August, September, when it's a little less windy, there'll be a giant American flag there, and that is truly, truly something to see. So the seaborne attack also failed. Baltimore was safe. The British did not take Baltimore, and just resumed, from a naval point of view, raiding up and down the Chesapeake Bay, burning small towns, causing havoc, which had been Admiral Coburn's modus operandi up until this point, to control the Chesapeake Bay. As the schooners and the privateers came out to fight him, it's like, if they're going to fight me, then I'm going to burn small towns here, there and wherever. So I'll go to Chestertown and fight a little engagement at Cork's Field. I'll burn Havre de Grace. I'll burn this town. I'll burn this town. But the army itself re-embarked on transports, and the new British commander, the new British general that would take command and the new direction of the war, would transfer the ground campaign from here. Early in the war, the ground campaign had been along the Canadian border, so we get the Battle of Queenstown's Heights and Lundy's Lane. The focus of the ground war had transferred here to the mid-Atlantic with the Battle of Bladensburg, Washington DC, Baltimore, and now the focus of the ground campaign towards the end of 1814 and into 1815 would move further south into the southern theatre of war, as the British troops would attempt to take the city of New Orleans. That's another story altogether. So that's essentially the role of Baltimore in the War of 1812. I would recommend anybody to come and visit Fort McHenry. It is a great place to visit, particularly in the summer where the Fort McHenry Guard are here in their reenacting uniforms, doing drill, doing the colour ceremony, raising and lowering of the flag, doing their artillery drill here. That's pretty impressive to see if you come on the anniversary weekend. So over the 12th, 13th, 14th of September every year, there's commemorative events here on the anniversary. Well worth seeing. It's well worth seeing at any time of the year. Get yourself a National Park Eagle Pass, that $80 a year that gets you into any national park with no additional cost. So visit 2 or 3 national parks, and that's paid for itself, that National Parks Eagle Pass, and come out here and visit Fort McHenry. It's a great place to come and visit. As you can see, it's right on the water. There's some great restaurants down in Locust Point that you can go to before or afterwards, or this is actually a really great place to come with a picnic, and in nice weather, picnic here. A lot of people come out here, walk their dogs, walk with their kids, run around the perimeter as a jogging track. It's very clean, very picturesque, very safe, Park Service property, and also right next to a Naval Reserve yard, very well policed. So I know some people have concerns about visiting Baltimore because Baltimore gets a bad reputation through media portrayal, but this is a nice, safe, clean, family safe environment for you to bring your kids to, bring your families to, bring a picnic to, explore some history. It's a particularly patriotic site as well. So I mean, you can tell from my accent that I'm not originally from the Baltimore region, and as I mentioned, I'm originally from 3,500 miles away, but I've lived here now for 20 something years, and I've been an American citizen for 20 something years. So this was one of the first locations that I visited when I came here, and visiting this place after I'd been made an American citizen, after I'd become a dual citizen and been sworn in as an American citizen, becomes a very different place for you to visit. It becomes a much more emotional place for you to visit. If you're in the visitor centre and you're watching the introductory movie, and then all of a sudden the curtains roll back, and there, lo and behold, is this flag flying above Fort McHenry. It's a very stirring and emotional experience, I think, for any American, no matter whether you're native born or immigrant like myself. Fort McHenry is a very special place to come to, and I would certainly recommend it to anyone that's thinking of visiting historic sites in the Mid-Atlantic region. I know you've got your Gettysburg, your Antietam's, museums in Washington DC, etc., but this is also a really good place to come and visit. So that was really the story of Baltimore in the War of 1812. I've got lots of links I'm going to post underneath this, or separately to the webpage. I have some links on some of the stuff that I've referenced, and I will post those as well. Sorry that I had connectivity issues earlier in the day. I was unable to live stream at midday, so I just fell back on the backup plan, which is to statically film the video. And I think in the end that gave me a different opportunity as well, because I decided, well, rather than me just stand in one location and talk for 35-40 minutes from one location, I'd actually move around a little bit. I'd move from Fells Point across to here at Fort McHenry and talk about different phases of the battle from some different parts of the terrain, and then I guess I'll run home now. I'll brave the rush hour traffic, and as soon as I get home, edit this together and pop this up on Facebook and YouTube for you. So thank you very much for joining me. Thank you for bearing with me with those connectivity issues that I sometimes get. You remember that I had those out and when we were doing the Pickett's Charge one during the summer at Gettysburg, so occasionally do have connectivity issues getting cell phone data, reliable cell phone data for live streaming. Thanks for supporting the talks. This is probably going to be a long one because I've been able to edit it and put it together on a video. So yeah, Okay, I'm going to finish up and then walk on back to the parking lot.
Actually, 10 minutes.
Okay, well, I'll start walking back now, okay? Okay, thank you guys.